any rubbish that has gone into the canal that you don't want in there, they would have the job of sort of fishing it out.
And they said that they did like weekly checks basically along that strip, and it was then that they came across Lindsay's body.
Just a quick disclaimer, the content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, crime scenes and other disturbing material. Listener discretion is advised. This episode is sponsored by Think Forensic.
Think Forensic are a one-stop shop for all things forensic science and crime solving. They hold experience days, as well as corporate events, team building events and general education for primary school right the way up to university level, as well as other events and consultancy. There's also a shop where you can get your hands on all things crime solving, from evidence gathering to packaging and collecting evidence, as well as other forensic science equipment.
For more information or to book on an experience day, please visit the website. Hi everyone and welcome to episode 32 of the Grave Secrets podcast. We're your hosts. I'm Annie.
And I'm Beth. Today we have another case study for you. If you listened right to the very end of last week's episode, we did mention that today's case has actually been requested. This is actually the second case now, isn't it, that's been requested by a listener, so that's very exciting. So this one has been requested by Brogan, so thank you ever so much for that. They did mention that DNA technology is an interesting element of this case.
Yep.
And it is something that we have talked about a lot in previous episodes, whether or not it be cases that have become cold cases that have been then solved later down the line.
Yeah, we normally talk a lot about the advances, especially in DNA, because I feel like it's the main one that's advanced the most, isn't it, over the years?
But then there have been quite a few cases that we've talked about when the investigation really accelerates as soon as they get a match on that DNA evidence.
Yeah.
So today's case is actually an unsolved murder. And I never know whether or not to mention that at the beginning or not, or whether it's a spoiler, but I have put it on the artwork for the episode.
You might have actually seen this more predominantly in the papers or on social media or on the news recently, because it is the 30th anniversary of the disappearance at the end of November. And I think this case, as this episode will air just around the time.
Yeah.
So we've been looking at that, haven't we, and seeing where we can direct people to if they do have any information on this case, because it is another local one.
It is. So again, this is a Yorkshire-based case, and it is the unsolved murder of Lindsay Jo Rimer.
Yep.
So we are, again, going to encourage anyone that listens to this episode, if this sparks a memory of any kind of description or weight in terms of, if you think it has any bearing on the case whatsoever, whether or not you think it's significant, it doesn't matter.
Yeah, even if it's not relevant, like, it might be helpful to lead on to something.
Yeah, so as you're listening, if you are from the Yorkshire area, if you think you have any form of information, or maybe even know someone that might, then please make sure that you pass that along.
Yep.
And we'll let you know in the show notes how to do that. So the case takes place on the 7th of November in 1994. Last week's case was actually 1993. So
it was. We've done two in a row. Were you born then, by 1994?
No, not yet.
Still not?
Just a year to go. But this, again, took place in November, so later on in the year. And it was early evening time. Lindsay Jo Rimer lived with her family, and they were living in Hebden Bridge. Again, like a terrace house, wasn't it, I think?
Yeah, Hebden Bridge is probably like 10, 15 minutes, if that, from here.
Yeah.
Because I always, when we do cases that are local, I always put them in the sat-nav
to
see how far they are away from my house. And it's quite a nice, like, rural area out in Hebden Bridge.
It's one of those where if there's anything I can't speak today, anything rural which is filmed, they tend to go like out Hebden Bridge way.
What was the one that was
Happy Valley?
Happy Valley was filmed in Hebden Bridge. So if you've watched that, you'll get a bit of an idea of what it actually looks like.
Yeah. So they lived in their family home, and Lindsay had decided that she'd got a craving early evening for cereal. And again, this is just one of those things that you think the case goes from something so normal, like, you know, early evening going, oh, do you know what? I don't actually want tea. I just really fancy a box of Cheerios. And then you can't get it out your head.
Yeah.
And then you're like, right, I'm going to have to go and get some. And generally speaking, these cases do start out like that, where someone is just out on a dog walk.
Something you wouldn't
doing
even
an everyday
think.
activity.
Yeah. You don't think it would escalate to what it is.
So she did. She headed out to the local shop down the road from her house, and unfortunately, that was the last time she was ever seen.
Yeah, she did actually head out, though, a little bit later, so she didn't head out until 10 p.m.
No.
So she must have been thinking, you know what it's like, you think, oh, yeah, I fancy eating that. Should I or shouldn't I go?
And as like 2 hours go by and you're like, no, stop thinking about it.
As a teenager, you'd probably be thinking, can I be bothered to walk to the shop or not?
Yeah.
Or, 2 hours pass quickly, don't they?
So her dad was in the house and he was on a phone call. So she'd just kind of gone out, and obviously she was thinking, I'm only nipping to the shop, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
Her mum was actually at the local, it looked like a workingmen's club. It was called the Trades Club.
Yeah.
And she was actually meeting a friend there. So on the way, because it was along the route to the spa, the shop, she actually stopped in to see her mother, who was called Geraldine.
Which you would as well, because remember, we're in 1994, not every child has got a mobile phone to ring the mom.
No.
So she called in to obviously get the money physically, probably to get the cash to then buy. And it is sort of what you're doing, isn't it? If you're walking past, you could just walk into a pub and go and see your mom. And her mom actually said to her when she went in, oh, do you want to sit down? Why don't you have a soft drink with us? Like, why don't you stay for a bit? And Lindsay had said, no, I want to get back. I'm going to get on with it. I'm going to make my way to the shop.
Yeah.
So then off she went to the shop to go and buy her cornflakes.
And she did. She got to the shop. It was a Spar. Again, just a little local corner shop, not a big supermarket. But she was spotted on CCTV buying the cereal, and that was at 10:22.
Yeah, so bearing in mind she'd left the house at around 10 p.m.
Yeah.
She'd called in to see her mum, and this is all within like a 20-minute window, really, isn't it? And she's probably spent 5 minutes going to talk to her mum and getting the money. And
yeah, because again, I do like you on Google Maps, and it said it was probably only like 10 to 15-minute walk to get to the shop. And again, it should have been 10 to 15 minutes before she was home again. Yeah,
but that CCTV of Lindsay in the shop was actually the last time that she was seen alive. So she didn't make it home that day. She actually didn't turn up for her paper round the next morning, which is what alerted people. And, you could think, well, how did the parents not know she'd come back and gone to bed? But like we've said, her dad was on a phone call. And
so he probably didn't even realise that she'd left the house in the first place, so he'd have no reason to check on her.
And then the mum, when she came back, obviously Lindsay had left however long ago. She'd seen her and she thought, well, she's already been back now. Yeah. And if she's in a bedroom, you don't want to disturb her if she's got school the next day, because it's already at this point when she saw her mum 10 o'clock. So you'd think, oh yeah, she's probably got to bed for school.
My mum would bloody disturb me no matter what time it was.
I think mine would, to be
fair. But effectively, as Annie's just mentioned, it was the fact that she then wasn't up in the morning ready for her paper round that the family thought, hang on a minute, has she not got up? And then went into a room, realised she wasn't there.
Probably went in just to say, get a move on, you've not turned up for your paper round, get out of bed.
Yeah, what are you doing?
And realised that Lindsay wasn't actually there. So that was on the morning of the 8th of November.
Again, the kind of place that we're talking about here is quite kind of small village, small town. Everyone knows everyone. Again, she quite clearly felt comfortable just popping into the local, working men's club and asking for where her mum was. Quite comfortable walking to the shop on her own. And generally in villages and towns like that, it is the case. It's quite quaint.
It's not a high crime area either. There's probably not a lot that goes on.
No, and yes, there's a lot of like dark streets because it's so rural, but it's not kind of dark alleyways and things like that, so much. So people are just used to it, aren't they?
Yeah.
So word did get out that Lindsay had disappeared. Obviously, they were trying to get hold of people for information. And she had actually been spotted along the route by 2 bus passengers. And that was near the entrance of Memorial Garden, which again would have been along that route that she'd have taken to get to the shop.
Yeah.
Now, from the off, I've just mentioned it's a small town, there were rumours. So quite often in cases like this, we do see rumours, and unfortunately there were rumours that might have been home related and that Lindsay wasn't necessarily happy and that she might have run away. And again, we've talked about the difficulty in police presuming that someone is a runaway rather than a missing person.
Yeah.
In some of the American cases we've covered, in the English cases,
Yeah.
I think it's just a problem that will always be there to some degree.
Yeah, in this case, Lindsay's family, when they spoke to the police, quickly sort of got rid of those
and
rumours.
It doesn't make any sense from an evidence perspective either. If you're deciding to meet, I mean, I ran away once when I was younger. Yeah, and when I ran away, I wasn't going to go to the shop and buy cornflakes or cereal or whatever, nor would I have stopped in at the pub to say hello to my mum.
Yeah.
If I was running away from home because I was annoyed at my parents.
Yeah, I think when the police would probably have spoken to the family, they would have quickly realised that this wasn't the case, because Lindsay was only 13 years old at the time of her disappearance. So she was born in 1981 in February. She was one of 4 siblings. She had 2 sisters and she had a brother as well. And they lived on Cambridge Street in Hebden Bridge with both parents.
Yeah.
So it seemed to be a nice sort of
family unit.
Yeah, family unit. She was in year 9 at Calder High School. Her friends had said she was popular, she was bubbly, she was happy and friendly. There was nothing that anyone said about Lindsay that would make her a runaway.
Yeah, like an angsty teen that's annoyed at her family.
She was really good at school, and her goal was to go to university. It wasn't like she didn't try at school or anything. She was a good student, she was a good friend. So nothing by this point pointed to what the police originally thought of being a runaway.
Yeah. And because of that sense of community in the area, there was a massive search pretty quickly, pretty instantaneously, which involved hundreds of people from the local area. And they all wanted to assist however possible. So they were searching the local area, obviously trying to get the word out there about the disappearance, feeding any information that they had, again, in terms of what she was actually like.
A lot of volunteers came forward, like the local community, family, friends, like so many people came together in the search for Lindsay, and they were searching Hebden Bridge, but they also searched the surrounding areas as well. So part of Rochdale Canal, the River Calder. So it was like all along her route home. They didn't just stick with one area. I feel like the search was quite wide to start with, and that's probably because she did have so many people. Like, I feel like in these small villages, everyone, like you said, knows everyone, and they're very quick to come together in things like this, aren't they, to help? Yeah.
And also, it's, nobody wants, I think especially, there seems to be something about in Britain as well, they don't kind of want a stain on their town or their village that's negative. So if we can quash it, if we can all work together
and get over it as quick as possible and get us out of the news,
then that's kind of the way it works. But unfortunately, despite the amount of people that were involved, there just weren't any significant leads.
I think a few days had gone past of the search and there was still sort of nothing, which is unusual, because normally, you'd think there must be something along that way, something to give some sort of evidence, but to just have nothing after 2 days will have been obviously really worrying for Lindsay's family and her friends.
Yeah.
But
again, so we mentioned that there's a canal. So Lindsay's house was kind of on the end, or well, not on the end, but at a dead end. And there was a big wall, and then the back of that wall was then the canal path.
Yeah.
So the likelihood is that wall was quite tall. She probably didn't go over that. But the likelihood is that she did at some point go on to the canal path to then walk down to the shop, because that would have been the quickest route. So you then have to wonder, again, we've now got water involved, whether or not she's slipped somehow and she's fallen into the canal. Obviously with the Sarah Bully case, that's what they believed happened there.
Or even hasn't even slipped somewhere, like might be stuck somewhere.
Yeah.
You know, she has fallen and she's injured herself.
Yeah.
And then been stuck. So there's so many places you need to check, especially if there's woodland area around.
Yeah. But unfortunately, again, despite doing those searches, there weren't any significant leads. And it wasn't until 5 months later that on the 12th of April, 1995, 2 canal workers came across something. They effectively, part of their role was to check Rochdale Canal, specifically Rawdon Mill was the area, which was nearly a mile away from Hebden Bridge where Lindsay had gone missing. But their job was to dredge, not dredge, I should say, but
they were removing, they had to remove anything that had fallen into the water, into the canal. So often, a lot of the time, they were removing sort of dead animals out of the way, like dead sheep that might have fallen
bags,
in.
Things like that.
Yeah, like any rubbish that has gone into the canal that you don't want in there, they would have the job of sort of fishing it out.
And they said that they did like weekly checks basically along that strip, and it was then that they came across Lindsay's body. Said that they'd found it weighed down, but it kind of flipped in the water as they were moving it, and they said that when they saw the hair, they realised that it was a body, and then at that stage that it was likely to be Lindsay's body.
Yeah, because it had been weighed down in some way, it had become dislodged.
Yeah.
So as it's become dislodged, then obviously would come up to
but again,
the surface.
It was a boulder that Lindsay's body was weighed down with, which instantly tells you this is not a suicide, nor is it accidental, because she has been physically tied to this boulder, which gives the impression that the offender has not wanted her body to be found. And what they actually discovered is that there was an actual dredging of the canal, which is when they pull up all of the water, and as part of that dredging of the canal, that's probably what had then dislodged her body.
Yeah, because that had only been taking place, the dredging operations had been taking place for a few days previous to this.
Yeah, so that was like early April, and then this was 12th of April. So.
Yeah, so it seemed like that could have been what dislodged it. But this was the body of Lindsay, but she disappeared 5 months earlier. So this is a whole 5 months later, which is crazy, and around about 2 kilometres away from where she had initially gone missing. Yeah.
And to think that it's instantly then gone from a missing persons case to a murder case, I think I can't imagine the fear of the unknown when someone's missing, not knowing what's actually happened to them. Must be just absolutely horrific. But there is still that hope there that either they've been held somewhere and that they're still alive and they'll be returned. If they have run away, that they'll return. But quite, all of a sudden you're going to have this sudden gut reaction when you find out that actually it is now a murder case.
I felt for the canal workers as well, because they said that they did actually think it was maybe like a sheep or something, or some animal that they needed to get out. So seeing that for them must have had like some impact. Obviously they called the police straight away, and then that's when it changed from a missing persons investigation to now we're looking at a murder investigation.
And one of the canal workers kind of described it in quite a lot of detail, didn't he, about finding it, and saying that he went home to his wife and just said, we found her. We found her, and didn't even need to say who she was, because again, in this area,
it's well known.
So unlikely that multiple people go missing that you would know straight away.
Yeah, and the police had actually previously searched parts of the canal, but hadn't search the section where Lindsay was found. So it was something due to the water flow in the canal that could have taken Lindsay's body upstream to where she was found.
Yeah.
And I don't think they'd worked out at the time that that's how it could have happened.
Yeah, they were just going downstream.
So they've searched downstream instead of searching upstream, which is also a logical thing to do, to look in how she's being carried downstream.
Yeah.
But that's why the whole of this area where she was found wasn't searched initially.
And again, we've talked about bodies in areas of water, and unfortunately that has a massive impact on the forensic evidence that you can then gather. It can deteriorate DNA massively. It obviously impacts decomposition of the body. But then again, if you were to do sexual assault testing to see whether or not she was assaulted before her death, those tests sometimes are inconclusive if the body's been affected by water. So it really does have a massive impact in terms of getting a better idea of motive, getting a better idea of offender.
Yeah.
It really kind of slows the process down in terms of investigating.
It does. One thing that I was not impressed at, I don't know what the word is for it, that the police managed to work out where they thought the body had been put in the water due to where the boulder was originally.
Yeah.
So they said that this boulder was normally by a factory.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't have been able to move this boulder like a huge amount of distance.
Yeah.
So they figured out that there was a certain point where she would have been put in the river, which would then sort of narrow down the area as to where she'd been killed, because you can sort of close in on it, can't you?
Yeah, and I think from what they said, that factory that was nearby...
So the disused factory.
Yeah, it had kind of lighting to a degree, so the offender would have been able to see what was going on, but it's not like there was any cameras or any floodlighting that would come on all of a sudden like you would get in some cases. So that led them to think that potentially the offender did know the area, or know that that was almost a safe place to be able to carry out the deposition of the body. Lindsay had been placed in the water in her clothes, and the same clothes that she was seen wearing in the CCTV. So again, the police then surmised that it's likely that she was killed quite quickly after her disappearance, rather than having been held somewhere. But again, I struggled with... There's not a lot of detail in this case in terms of the investigation, I wouldn't say. And I think part of that is because it is still unsolved. But I did find that there did appear, I'm being very, very vague, to be quite a lot of surmising. So like they'd said it didn't look, or it didn't appear that she'd been sexually assaulted because she was still wearing her clothes. But then I thought, but you could redress someone, and obviously the clothes might have been put back on well, but then she's been in the water, so that would have affected it.
Yeah.
Equally, you know, if there's no signs of sexual assault, then that could have been affected by the water.
Yeah.
So I just don't think you can say categorically yes or no.
So on those lines as well, I thought when they said, oh, because she's in the same clothes, it looks like she was killed pretty soon after.
Yeah.
Well, no, because if someone had kidnapped her and held her, she's not going to change the clothes.
No, exactly.
So it's sort of in the few things that we found to watch on it. It was a lot of
and you
speculation.
do have to come up with there's a fine line between theorizing, and you have to consider every possible theory. I understand that, but then it's what you then do to work towards the outcome. And it's when they focus on one of those theories more heavily than another. It was Andy Glover that was one of the canal workers that had actually discovered the body. And again, he said that they did those checks weekly. So was it that she was then deposited sometime after? Or was it that it was the dredging of the canal that had dislodged the body, and
it was it was thought to have dislodged, or it was thought to have been this.
Yeah.
But the Lindsay's body was then sent to the Royal Halifax Infirmary, where a post-mortem was carried out, and that was the Home Office pathologist Mike Green. And Lindsay's body was weighed down with 2 concrete boulders. Like we've said, she was wearing the clothes when she disappeared, but the pathologist determined that the cause of death was due to strangulation. So there was signs of a struggle, because Lindsay's larynx, so that'd be her voice box, had been sort of flattened. So that shows there's a lot of force that has been used on the neck.
In some cases with strangulation, you get the hyoid bone, which is broken, which is this front bone kind of. And that is quite commonly seen when someone's been strangled from behind. So when you get someone's hand around your neck and then they're behind you strangling you, quite often they see a break of the hyoid bone. In this case, it was pressure, and it was the larynx pressing then against the spinal cord that had obviously then meant that she couldn't breathe and caused her to die. There didn't seem, again, from what we know, to be a lot of other significant injuries.
Yeah.
So then that makes you think, because generally we would see maybe a head injury where they've subdued the victim to then be able to strangle them.
Yeah.
But this just appeared to be strangulation. So you think, okay, so did she know the offender, and that's how they managed to get her in? Because strangulation, not only does it take a lot longer than people realise, it's like 5 or 6 minutes before you've actually strangled someone to death.
In close proximity.
But you've got to be able to get in close proximity to them in the first place.
Yeah, and the pathologist said that they thought that Lindsay's body had been in the canal for quite some time, so most likely since she disappeared. So now we've got the pathologist's opinion on it.
Yeah.
It's sort of more solid than just them saying, oh, well, she's in the same clothes sort of thing. Because even though a body will decompose different in water, you've got to think how experienced the pathologist is in this stuff. Like, he will still be able to determine some things, even back in the 90s.
And again, just conducting a post-mortem on a victim at the age of 13 that's had a 20-pound boulder weighing her down in the canal, it's just horrific, isn't it?
Yeah.
So the investigation continued. They were then pretty sure that they knew the route that Lindsay had taken, so we're obviously trying to gain as much information about that as possible. And they did have a significant lead at this stage, didn't they, that had come through since announcing that Lindsay's body had been found.
Yeah, because they sort of like started and opened a new appeal to gather a bit more information and see if anyone's memory could be sort of refreshed as well.
Yeah. So at this stage, there was reports that a red Honda Civic had been stolen from an area called Meanwood in Leeds. So again, Leeds to Hebden Bridge is, what would you say, like half an hour, 45 minutes?
Maybe half an hour, if that, because it takes me 25 to get to Leeds. Okay, so it's not even that, I don't think.
Yeah, so around half an hour away. But that this Honda Civic that had been stolen from Leeds was then seen in Hebden Bridge on the night of Lindsay's disappearance. And they'd managed to trace the driver of that vehicle, and he was described as being a bearded male, and he had been stopped for approaching young teenage girls, in some cases near that shop, the Spa shop. And basically winding the window down and talking or trying to talk to them.
I think some of the people that he approached were even Lindsay's like school classmates or school friends.
Yeah, I think they were. And again, can you imagine how scary that'd be for the kids, because they'd think, God, that could have been me.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? Again, we don't know that it's him at that stage, but that's what would be going through your mind, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
If there was someone that had been approaching.
Yeah. Since this new appeal as well, there was another lead that came in, and a man had said that he had seen 2 men in Hebden Bridge that night acting suspicious, and they'd sort of sped away in a green van. And the police actually managed to track this green van all the way back to Ireland. They spoke to the owner and managed to eliminate him from the investigation. So that's you know, how they could track back then as well all the way to Ireland. It's not as easy as it obviously is now. But the police did actually speak to over 5,000 people in this investigation, and they gathered over 100 witness statements from the night that Lindsay disappeared. So that is a lot of people to speak to, because in that area, that's probably quite a lot of people in the area.
Well, again, I'm
it?
going back to preaching about time and manpower, because here you've got, not only are we now liaising with a force in Ireland, and it probably takes a couple of working days. It's not going to be their top priority. You know, it's probably going to take a few days to be able to track that back, get the information, then speak to the driver who's probably now back in Ireland.
Yeah.
But then you've got all of these other inquiries, or all of these leads that are coming in, and you've got to process them just as thoroughly as each other. And just the amount that they'd have had to go through. And
not just all these people that they've spoken to. So you've got 5,000 people they've spoken to, 100 people's witness statements, and then I think there was something like 1,200 vehicles that were looked at as well. So just the pure manpower going into that for a small force as well, because it would be West Yorkshire Police, but I'm guessing the area covering sort of Hebden Bridge would be like quite a small force to start with. Obviously they'll have got more of the officers in to help when the body was found.
And again, 1,200 vehicles were looked into as well. So you've got all of those people giving witness statements, but then the amount of vehicles that were checked for whether or not they'd have got anything. You've then got to check for the vehicle in the area, and then check the keeper or the owner or whoever's been driving it. It's just never ending. But I must say, and this might seem somewhat not controversial, I don't think, but generally speaking, as a chief inspector or a police officer, with some of the cases that we've talked about, they seem to get a lead, or they'll have a significant piece of evidence, and then the case will move quite quickly. And yes, obviously it's horrific what's happened, but in terms of it being your day-to-day job, they must be quite interesting cases to work on. And fulfilling, because they are gathering intel all of the time, gaining more information, and then ultimately putting a case together to catch the offender. I felt when I was researching this case that it must have been quite demoralising to work on this case, because you had all that time go by that they'd not really had any significant leads that helped find Lindsay. Then they've found her body, but we've still not really got any significant information in terms of narrowing down even to a lead suspect. Never mind, you know, you've had persons of interest, but not really enough to get anywhere. And I just feel like if you were working on this case day in, day out and not really getting anywhere, it must have been really tough.
It's frustrating as well, because I always talk about, in especially my line of work, when a lot of people ask me, how do you deal with working on like a crime scene or big cases? And my answer is always that I always think I am helping the family. So I am doing what I can for the family. So that might be to help identify their loved one. It might be helping get the loved ones back to them. It might be helping get the loved one's belongings back to them. And is all I think, that's how I get through it in my head, that I'm helping the family. But in this case, because this is unsolved, and you know, you've now got Lindsay's body as well, the police can't have thought in the head, I'm helping the family. They're trying to help the family, but they can't. Like, there's nothing.
They're not getting anywhere, kind of thing. And it makes you wonder how many of those cases an inspector. I'd love to have. We need to try and get a chief inspector or someone on the podcast, because I would love to ask them, you know, one of these cases that remains unsolved, or that's really tough in terms of gaining intel, must be bad enough. But if you've got multiple, for the amount of years that you'll work in the force, you know, if you've got 3 or 4 people that you can reel off as either still missing persons or an unsolved case, that must be really tough to live with. Not that it's anything on them, but you'd still take it to heart. Absolutely.
I would.
Yeah.
I definitely would, because like of obviously the way that I think that I deal with the situations.
Yeah, process things.
But in this case, we've spoke about the suspect with the Honda Civic. There was quite a few sort of speculations going around about suspects. So there was one that was John Taylor. He killed Leeds teenager Leanne Tiernan in 2000. That was also in West Yorkshire, so it was the same area, but the police looked into him and there wasn't really anything to connect him. There was another suspect called John Oswin, so he was a convicted rapist. He was jailed in 1998, but it was a different MO.
Yeah.
So the police had sort of ruled him out.
I get there was another man called Tony King, and he was a line of inquiry in the early 2000s because he'd committed violent offences around the same time. But again, they were violent offences like armed robbery and didn't really have any, or seem to have any connection
link
necessarily.
And it's what the police would have done is had already had a look on the database at anyone who has got like offences for anything violent, anything against children, anything against young girls. They probably would have looked into sexual assault as well.
Yeah.
If you can hear anything in the background,
I was just about to say, do you think we should check?
I don't know what's going on outside, but it's as if they're digging up the entire room that we're in.
A lorry reversing and
yeah, but it's been doing it for the last 5 minutes.
Yeah, but you know that episode of Clarkson's Farm where he has to get so many bags off this big
I think
lorry?
This is what they're doing.
That must be one of the,
They are going backwards and forwards outside, and we are underground, and it is right outside our tiny little window.
And we should check how much you can hear.
Noise like it. I don't think there's much we can do if
I suppose
it's not stopping anytime soon. There was also like local speculation, and this is just pure speculation. That Scottish serial killer Peter Tobin, the public thought it could have been him, so he was convicted of 3 murders of 3 girls. That was between 1991 and 2006, and Lindsay's profile did fit the victims, but there was no link to say that he was anywhere near. It is a lot of speculation.
It was interesting with this one as well, because obviously people want to get to the bottom of it. So that, again, fine line between coming up with potential theories and then hindering the case, because actually just throwing things out there that you've got no actual evidence to prove. And I started writing down all of these different like people that might have been, and then I thought, no, it is speculation, and I don't really want to talk about that because there's no evidence. There was a man called Richard Babcock who is a forensic psychologist, and in 2000 he came out with a statement that basically said that he did think that Lindsay's murder was sexually motivated. Now, again, I believe that there is potential that is true, because with most offences, even if there hasn't been direct signs of sexual assault, it doesn't mean that it wasn't sexually motivated. They might get sexual gratification from strangulation. Yeah. They might have not had any direct sexual contact with the victim, but it doesn't mean to say that that wasn't a potential motive. Yeah. However, he didn't just stop there, because he then went on to give another idea of who he thought had committed the offence. But again, when then someone said, well, what makes you think it was them? They said, because a police officer told me that they were involved. So they said, okay, well, then what police officer was it? And they were like, I don't want to say anything. And I just think, well, if it's not legitimate information that you can back up, then why are you saying it at all? Yeah. But he released a book. And so, again, I think it's self-serving to some degree.
Yes, I agree. So in this case, sort of months turned into years, and the case had actually gone cold. Lindsay's family had kept trying, and her family hold vigils in November every year. I think it was Katie, her older sister, who when Lindsay first went missing, she actually did the reconstruction, and she put on the same clothes that Lindsay would have been wearing, and she did the walk to the shop,
which must be so unnerving.
Yeah, it's awful for her. But in April 2016, there was Lindsay's younger sister, Juliet, did a reappeal as well. So Juliet suspect was only a baby at the time of Lindsay's disappearance. So she said that she didn't really have that much of a memory of time with her, but obviously she knew from, photographs and things like that. So West Yorkshire Police in 2016 had actually started working with a team of Canadian forensic specialists to obtain a DNA profile of Lindsay's killer. So it was not disclosed where the DNA profile was found.
Yeah.
So none of that information has been released to the public. So a DNA profile was actually found, but it's not been able to be matched to anyone. So it's either a very sort of like degraded sample or it's really, really tiny. And I know that over time, since the 90s, DNA has advanced now.
Yeah.
So hopefully it'll keep advancing over time. And however small this DNA profile is, hopefully at some point they will get a match.
And that is because, again, they retest these samples. Potentially, like every 6 months, they will retest them to just check whether or not something flags up in the system.
And as well, like in 2016, obviously the police are working with different forensic experts, but there was also 2 arrests made in 2016.
Yeah.
So these men were both arrested on separate occasions, but they were then released. So they were in Bradford. It was 2 men from Bradford, a 63-year-old and a 68-year-old, were both suspected and both later released.
Yeah.
But if you think about like all the time that has gone by in between, that is a long time from 1994 to 2016.
There's so much unknown because you don't know whether it was someone who Lindsay did know, they had an argument, maybe they committed the murder of Lindsay and then covered it up and have lived with that ever since and never gone on to commit any more offences. Or whether it's someone that has offended again. We just don't know.
Because we do speak about people not just going in with murder. There's usually a bit of a build-up, isn't there, on the criminal side
But then
of it.
again, there are cases where someone will commit murder in a crime of passion, the heat of the moment, and then probably never, ever commit a crime again because they realise
how bad it is,
what they've done. But again, in this case, unfortunately, there just isn't enough evidence either way to say what has actually categorically happened.
That's why it's so hard, isn't it? Because a lot of the information that is available to us when we've been researching, and we've said before, we don't just use one, we don't just do Wikipedia, and we watch different videos. We try to get as many interviews that have got family members in it, so we can try and find out firsthand. But because there wasn't that much available, we are just going on what we've managed to, what's available to us online.
And in the late 90s, early 2000s, there was something called Operation Enigma, and that's a national cross-force inquiry. And again, we've mentioned other similar inquiries in the past. This one was specifically designed to further investigate the unsolved murders of 207 women in Britain. So there are, or as of that time, there were 207 unknown cases. And that inquiry will retest DNA samples to see if there's any connections. But not only that, it also helps the police try and either rule out or identify whether or not there is a similar MO in any of these cases, whether or not there's similar victimology, and just to give them a better idea of whether or not any cases are linked, and equally whether or not there is a serial offender that's gone unknown.
Undetected in between,
to try and put that to a halt. However, in the case of Lindsay, through Operation Enigma, it is believed that they've ruled out any links to any of those other unsolved cases, and that it was a standalone offence.
Not a serial killer.
Okay. But just that sheer number, I mean, we have obviously referenced victims in so many cases now, but to know that there's 206 other women,
that's a lot, isn't it,
in Britain, whose families have no idea what has happened to their loved one.
No.
It's just crazy. And again, that's another huge resource. You know, you've got all these crimes that are taking place on a daily basis, and the amount of work that goes into crime when it happens at that time. But then you've still got to have people that are working on these cases, because it's just as important to get justice and get the truth.
Yeah. And the only other thing that I've got left to talk about on this is there was a retired detective sergeant called John Matthews from Cleveland Police. And in 2017, he stated that a man that he had questioned in relation to 2 other murders, so it was Tina Bell and Julie Hogg, actually had connections to Hebden Bridge. Unfortunately, this man had died in 2005, so he wasn't able to be questioned by the time this had come around. But it was found that he had moved to Hebden Bridge in 1990, and he did work at the Trades Club.
Right.
So there was a link, and he would have seen Lindsay maybe come in and speak to her mom.
Yeah, he knows of the family at least.
Yeah. But in 2023, this case was actually discussed on Channel 4's Footsteps of Killers, and John Matthews actually discusses his theory in more detail. But like we've said, there's nothing so far that has led the police to make a connection. It's just this one detective, and this guy has died. So it's hard to then link any evidence, isn't it? But that was all I could really find, digging a little bit deeper into it.
So that's why it's so important that if you know of anyone that lived in the Hebden Bridge area at this time, so this is 1994, if you know of anyone that lived in the area at that time, please, if they aren't already, make them aware of this case, or even just ask them about it. Let them familiarise themselves with it again, because if there is any information, it could be really crucial, even if you don't necessarily think it's significant. Again, if you know of anyone that maybe frequented the spa or worked in the area at the time, if there is any vehicle that you know of, anything, any piece of information, whether or not it's you specifically or whether or not it's someone that you know, it's really important that we just keep this case alive, and again, like the family are doing,
refresh people's memories. And I know that this year, so 2024, there was actually a fresh appeal on Crime Watch, because it is approaching the 30th anniversary. So anyone, just to get the conversation started, really open up the, being able to talk about this case, and hopefully
there will at some point.
They will be able to solve it, and just to get peace for the family, peace of mind for the family.
Absolutely, because they are still working tirelessly. If you think that's 30 years of their life, that they've gone on to have families of their own, but there is still such a massive part that is unknown, and you're left with that hole. So, if there's anything that anyone can do to try and assist the family in their campaign for keeping Lindsay's case in the public interest, then it's so important.
I think that Lindsay's family have done a great job of keeping this at the forefront, especially around the anniversary times, by still holding the vigils, still getting the appeals out. I think the family have done a brilliant job.
Absolutely. So that's it from us today. That's been the case of Lindsay Jo Rimer. Again, if you've got any information at all,
I'll put it all in the notes. Show notes. Anything that we can find where you can, ring in or tell anyone anything.
And even if you just do some more investigating of your own, in terms of finding information, then that'd be great. There's also a Facebook group, I believe, that one of her sisters set up, which just has all of the information that they have from the police.
Okay.
So we'll add that in there.
We'll add that in.
But apart from that, we will be with you again next week. And in the meantime, take care.
Bye.